Lieberman, let me start with you.
Okay.
We were together in Paris this year, and I've heard you describe quite eloquently the gathering and how impressed you were, what moved you. Can you talk a little bit about your impressions from the Paris conference? And also, you've been an advocate together with I and others for Camp Liberty. Would you also talk about Paris and Camp Liberty a little bit?
It was actually an extraordinary experience for me and my wife. The first thing is, you know, I've been blessed in my life. I've been a U.S. Senator. I ran for Vice President in 2000. I spoke to very big audiences. I have never spoken to more people at once in my life than I did at that meeting in France of the National Resistance of Iran. And that was 100,000 people. And from all over the world, obviously probably some more proportionally from Europe, because Europe was where it was, a lot of people from America, a lot from Connecticut, but really beyond, numbers do say something, which is an expression of the global interest in this cause of a free Iran. And I was very impressed by, beyond the numbers, the substance of what was talked about. It was the first opportunity I had to meet Mrs. Rajavi. She is really a brilliant leader, a very principled leader, very charismatic leader. This is a regime that says that it is religious, and yet to me, and it's expressed in our Declaration of Independence, the most profound religious belief is that we're all here not by accident, but as the creation of God. And each one of us, every person, deserves those rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And this regime every day denies those rights to its political opponents, to women, to minorities. You could go on and on. And that, the contrast between the Islamic Republic of Iran and the program of the national resistance, as stated by Mrs. Rajavi, was quite moving. So it was an extraordinary transformational day. Let me just say a quick word about Camp Liberty. And this is very important. I know you've done it over the years. You've got to keep doing it. So you still have, as you well know, in the government of Iran, the people who have of Iraq, the people who have responsibility for oversight of what happens at Camp Liberty are the people who are still essentially, they're very close to Iran, let's put it that way, and they're doing Iran's work. So there's another reason, of course, why America has to take the lead in protecting the people of Iran. It's because of Camp Liberty. It's because they are there and being mistreated according to every standard of human rights and decency because the United States broke a promise to them that if they gave up their weapons and left Ashraf and went to Camp Liberty, we would protect them. We haven't. And, you know, the more I follow and I've been involved in foreign policy, the more I feel like the best foreign policy is the policy that you and I would follow in our lives and want to follow in our lives. We're loyal to our friends. We know who our enemies are, and we're cautious with them. We'd like them to become our friends, but we're not going to sacrifice our friends for that. And when we make a promise, we keep it.
Jack, let me ask you about promises, commitments that we as a U.S. government, when we were still in government, we exhorted the MEK at Ashraf to give up their weapons in exchange for our security. And over time, we abrogated that promise. What do you see as kind of the U.S.'s obligation, to the continuing obligation to those that we left behind without the security with the Iraqi regime?
Yeah. Well, That certainly is an issue, and Iraq in general is an issue in terms of an abdication, promises made and promises kept, and a commitment to Iraq in general. When this administration took over in January of 2009, what remained in Iraq was a relatively stable security situation, but a political process that needed to grow and develop. And it was really in its infancy, and it had its first leader, who was not a very desirable leader, who is a nefarious character, to say the least, talking about Maliki. And what needed to happen was the growth and development of a political class that was sensitive and determined to power share and also develop a bureaucracy that could attend to its people. When we ended conflicts in the past in Germany, Japan, Italy, Korea, Bosnia-Herzegovina, the Philippines, we left military forces there, not necessarily for security, but for influence. And we chose not to do that here, and we also pulled away from, unknown to many people in this country, we pulled away from Iraq geopolitically. And it was just one of the most irresponsible strategic blunders we ever made. And we did that right on the heels of the broken promise dealing with the residents of Camp Liberty. So our record here of not doing what's right is pretty significant. And we do not have ISIS if we didn't break the promises we made in Iraq. That's the reality of it. I know for a fact, because I was there assisting General Petraeus. So our policies as it pertains to Liberty, our policies as it pertains to Iraq, has created a significant challenge in the Middle East.
What do you think of this notion of trying to enlist Iran's help now in fighting ISIS?
They want America, as I think they were able to achieve in terms of their geopolitical objective. They wanted a stable but weak Iraq that was under their influence, and America not present. They pretty much got that. But now they have ISIS, and they don't want that. So their national interest certainly is go back to what they had before, a stable but weak Iraq, and certainly not ISIS dominating over a third of the country. So it's in their national interest to do something about ISIS. And it's in our national interest to do something about it as well. That doesn't mean for a minute, though, that we should join together. I find that morally reprehensible, that we could ever sit down across the table with them and begin to coordinate an effort towards a common objective, which is the defeat of ISIS. That can never be done because of the record of what they have done to us.
Senator Lieberman?
Let me just add a word to what General Keenan said. I agree with everything he said. But when you think about it, the idea that the United States would cooperate with the current regime in Iran to fight ISIS is the ultimate in shooting ourselves in the foot, in hypocrisy. In other words, the idea would be that we would join with what our own State Department says is the #1 state sponsor of terrorism to fight terrorism? I mean, it's just ridiculous. The other thing it does in terms of our long-term policy is that it legitimizes the government of Iran. And look, if this ever comes to be, the Iranians are not going to do this for nothing. They're going to ask for us to bend over more in negotiations on nuclear weapons. And implicit in this is the worst thing of all. If we begin to cooperate with Iran, this regime, against ISIS, it will effectively mean abandoning what must be, by virtue of who we are as Americans, our clear goal which is to get rid of the regime that is now tyrannizing the people of Iran. That has to be our goal.
Following on to the idea that if your goal is to weaken the Iranian regime, to further the ultimate overthrow of the regime, one of the key pieces to such a strategy would be to undermine its chief allies, one of whom is Bashar al-Assad in Syria. And we don't seem, the administration has been, to be most charitable, they've been unclear. You might actually say they've affirmatively been weak about saying they would take on overthrowing Assad. But to take Assad out of the equation absolutely is a devastating blow to the mullahs in Iran. Can each of you talk about your thoughts about what we ought to be doing about Assad, why we're not doing more, and what you think we should be doing?
Well, you know, along with Senator McCain and others, right from the beginning of the uprising in Syria, I felt that we should be supporting the opposition to Assad. Assad was our enemy. Assad was the major, in some senses, the lone supporter of Iran, our major enemy in the region that he had, and yet we stood back, which was a terrible moral mistake, because now 200,000 people have lost their lives. But it was also a diplomatic mistake because it strengthened Iran. I saw a story in the paper today that it's one of those stories where you rub your eyes and you read it again. I'd say the most significant foreign policy mistake of this administration, and maybe of American foreign policy in some time, was when the president set the red line. If Assad used chemical weapons, we would have to take action. He used them, and then the president basically didn't take action. So the leaders around the world saw what President Obama did regarding that red line. And I can tell you, because I've talked to them, the worst thing we could do for the security of the United States, and frankly for the security of the world, on which the security of the United States and the prosperity of the United States depends, is to somehow follow Europe to get into bed with Iran and Russia to try to solve the problem in Syria. I mean, history warns us not to do that.
General Keane?
Yeah, this area is really a debacle in terms of our foreign policy. It's similar to July 2009 in the streets of Tehran. We turned a deaf ear to that. We said no. We wouldn't. Here are people that are willing to fight and die for the principles that we have in this country, and we wouldn't give them the weapons to help them. They did not want us to fight side by side. They weren't asking for that. I mean, that was a horrific decision that we made. That movement initially had momentum, even without the weapons that they needed, because they had numbers on their side. Those numbers truly made a difference. And guess what? The Russians and the Iranians looked at that and they saw their ally in trouble. And the Iranians came, it was all in. They brought their best generals to this problem. One of their two-star generals from the Revolutionary Guards Force was killed in Syria. Killed as a result of it. They put thousands of Quds Force on the ground to assist. They brought Hezbollah in, their leaders, by the thousands to assist, to help prop up this regime. And even watching that, nothing happened on our side. The numbers grew. Now we're standing at 200,000 dead, 6 million displaced out of their homes. It is horrific. He makes war against people. He starves entire communities. I have pictures of it at the Institute for the Study of War. Warehouses full of dead people who look like something out of Auschwitz, where their bones are sticking out of their bodies. They're all dead from starvation. He has attacked 65% of all the hospitals and destroyed them. He destroys ambulances. He attacks bakeries because it's a food source. This is a systematic and methodical extermination of people. It is genocide in every sense of the word. And here, this country turns a deaf ear to that. I took all of this and showed some of these pictures to Secretary Kerry to make him familiar with what the methodology is and the systematic. We know he bombs, but not everybody knows the extent of the killing that is going on and the genocide that is taking place. But now we have ISIS, so we're involved in Syria. And we were absolutely naive in not recognizing what would eventually take place. There's no easy solution here, but our policy still, to this day, is fundamentally flawed in not dealing with Assad.
Thank you, General Keane. General Keane, let me ask you, on the subject of ISIS, what does success look like? How do we, similar to the question I asked about the Iranian regime, where do we go from here and how do we get there?
Yeah. To do this, you have to have a comprehensive strategy to defeat them. Military is part of that, and it has to be. And we certainly have the capability to remove them from the territory in Syria, which will take longer if we're not willing to truly support a ground force. So dealing with ISIS, it's a manageable problem. And if we organize and we commit and we have the resolve to do it, we can. But there's a larger problem out there that we're not facing, and that is radical Islam. And it will come at us again by another name if we don't face up to it.
I just want to quickly add a thought which Jack's insight inspires, which I know you know, but maybe it's important that you stress it and think of yourself this way. You are frontline troops in the fight against radical Islam. I mean, you represent the alternative. The capital of radical Islam is in Tehran. In your opposition to them, and this is not vague, the program that the National Resistance, MEK, the program that I heard Mrs. Rajavi express in France that day is a program, an alternative, an Islamic alternative to radical Islam. You're part of the hope for the future. My wife was really inspired by that, our visit there. I must be honest and say for two reasons. She thought the program of the movement was great, and she loved the fact that the movement is led by a woman.